There is a moment the system does not prepare for. It prepares for obedience. It prepares for rebellion. It even prepares for outrage. But it does not prepare for your calm. As long as you are afraid, you are manageable. As long as you fear exclusion, instability, insignificance, or isolation, your behavior remains predictable. And predictability is the foundation of control. The system does not need to restrain you physically if it can shape your anticipation. It simply needs you to believe that stepping outside its expectations will cost you something you cannot survive. So you adjust yourself before you are corrected. You hesitate before you speak. You compromise before you are pressured. Over time, this adjustment feels responsible, mature, sensible. But what it really is fear operating quietly beneath your decisions. And then something changes. You begin testing the consequences you once avoided. You step into discomfort instead of away from it. You realize rejection does not destroy you. You realize uncertainty does not erase you. You realize standing alone does not end you. And in that realization, something internal recalibrates. You are no longer afraid. That is the moment the system begins to notice. Michel Foucault once wrote, "Where there is power, there is resistance. But the most destabilizing resistance is not loud or dramatic. It is psychological. It is the moment power loses its emotional leverage over the individual. When threats no longer produce obedience, power must reconsider its strategy. And that reconsideration is where tension begins. How fear becomes the system's greatest weapon. The system does not rely primarily on force. Force is inefficient and visible. It invites backlash. Instead, it relies on anticipation. It conditions you to simulate negative outcomes in your mind so vividly that you alter your behavior before consequences ever arrive. You imagine losing your place in the social hierarchy. You imagine financial instability. You imagine becoming irrelevant without institutional recognition. You imagine isolation if your views diverge too far from the accepted script. These imagined losses activate the same neural circuits as physical danger. Your body responds as if survival is at stake. And once survival feels threatened, compliance becomes automatic. This is why control works best when it feels voluntary. You begin to monitor yourself. You refine your personality to remain acceptable. You align your ambitions with what is rewardable. You soften your convictions to avoid friction. Eventually, this internal editing becomes identity. You call it professionalism. You call it being realistic. You call it understanding how the world works. But beneath that polished language is a simple mechanism: fear directing behavior. As long as fear dictates your boundaries, the system does not need to intervene. You will do the adjusting for it. That is why visible rebellion rarely destabilizes it. Rebellion still revolves around the structure. It is reactive. It is emotional. It is predictable. But when fear dissolves, predictability dissolves with it. When you look at consequences and genuinely believe you can survive them, the architecture of control begins to weaken. Because the system's greatest weapon was never punishment. It was your anticipation of punishment. In The Dark Knight, the Joker says, "Introduce a little anarchy, upset the established order, and everything becomes chaos." Most people interpret that as a statement about destruction, but the deeper truth is about predictability. Established order depends on expected reactions. When people behave in ways that align with fear-based incentives, systems remain stable. When someone stops reacting as expected, uncertainty enters the equation. And uncertainty is destabilizing, not because it is violent, but because it cannot be easily managed. Developing psychological immunity to fear. Becoming fearless does not mean becoming reckless. It means expanding your tolerance for discomfort to the point where fear no longer governs your choices. Psychological immunity is built through controlled exposure. When you deliberately engage in actions that risk disapproval, you begin retraining your nervous system. When you pursue goals without guaranteed applause, you weaken the association between validation and worth. When you allow yourself to be misunderstood without rushing to correct perception, you reduce dependency on acceptance. Initially, this process is uncomfortable. Your body interprets deviation as danger. Anxiety surfaces. Doubt intensifies. But if you remain steady rather than retreating into compliance, a recalibration begins. You discover that many consequences you feared are survivable. Some even reveal hidden strength. Losing certain forms of approval clarifies your values. Operating without constant reassurance strengthens internal authority. Standing alone reveals that isolation is not annihilation. As your threshold for discomfort increases, fear loses its dominance. It does not disappear entirely. It simply stops issuing commands. And once fear stops commanding you, the external structures that relied on it lose efficiency. You are no longer easily motivated by threat. You are no longer easily pacified by reward. You become self-directed. And self-direction is difficult to control. How to train yourself to stop being controlled by fear. Transformation begins with awareness. Identify where your decisions are primarily driven by avoiding discomfort rather than pursuing truth. Notice where you silence yourself to maintain approval. Notice where you overcommit to secure relevance. Notice where you tolerate environments that diminish you because uncertainty feels riskier than dissatisfaction. Once identified, introduce deliberate friction. Have one honest conversation where you would normally remain neutral. Decline one expectation that exists solely to preserve image. Reduce one dependency that ties your identity to external metrics. Observe your internal reaction without immediately correcting it. The anxiety you feel is not proof of danger. It is evidence of conditioning being challenged. Allow the discomfort to exist without retreating. Parallel to this internal work, strengthen your external resilience. Diversify income streams when possible. Develop transferable skills. Build relationships rooted in shared values rather than shared fear. The more options you create, the less leverage fear holds over you. Practice intentional non-reaction. When provoked, pause. When pressured, slow down. When criticized, observe before responding. Reaction confirms control. Measured stillness disrupts expectation. Over time, your nervous system adapts to independence. You begin operating from choice rather than reflex. And that shift is what changes everything. There is something deeply unsettling about a person who is no longer afraid, not aggressive, not rebellious, not chaotic, just steady. When you are no longer afraid of exclusion, you stop negotiating your authenticity for belonging. When you are no longer afraid of instability, you stop trading freedom for predictability. When you are no longer afraid of insignificance, you stop performing for recognition. When you are no longer afraid of standing alone, you realize solitude sharpens clarity rather than diminishing worth. The system does not collapse in response to this. It recalculates. Because power depends on emotional leverage, and emotional leverage depends on fear. Once fear loses credibility in your nervous system, control becomes inefficient. Threats feel smaller. Rewards feel optional. Pressure feels negotiable. You begin to see incentives where others see ideals. You recognize conditioning where others see normalcy. This clarity is not loud. It doesn't demand attention. It simply withdraws psychological dependency. And when enough individuals withdraw that dependency, power must shift from intimidation to negotiation. You do not need to overthrow anything. You simply stop being internally governed by fear. And once fear fails, you are no longer easily shaped. You are no longer easily herded. You are no longer easily intimidated. You stand, calm, unafraid. And that quiet independence is what the system never planned for.